Southside Chicago. The wind carried snow through the alley, mixing with the smell of diesel exhaust and damp asphalt. It was the kind of night where nothing moved unless it had to. Men gathered in the abandoned warehouse, drawn by the promise of debts settled, deals made, and something stranger. Her name was Clara Weston, 27 years old. Gray wool dress frayed at the hem, hands bound in front of her like she was holding something in that couldn't get out. Her father shoved her into the center of the warehouse like she was meat on display. She can cook, clean, and keep her mouth shut, he said. Whoever's got the cash can take her home tonight. The crowd didn't laugh. Not out loud, but the silence between the murmurs was worse. Shadows shifted. Cigarettes glowed like hungry eyes. Clara stood there, the cold biting her skin, but the shame beneath it burned hotter. She's barren, her father added. Tried for years. Nothing. But she's still young enough. Still got use in her. Clara didn't beg. She'd done that before. Once when her husband threw her out after 3 years of trying. Once when his fists found her face for the last time. It hadn't mattered then, so she stood in silence. Near the back of the warehouse, her mother stood in the doorway. Old coat pulled tight around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the floor, lips pressed into a line. She didn't speak, didn't stop it, just watched. And when the crowd shifted, she slipped away with them, head low, swallowed by the night like she hadn't come to watch her daughter be assigned only to leave with everyone else. The main door opened. Cold air rushed in. A man stepped through, broad-shouldered, black coat dusted with snow. The collar of his overcoat cast a shadow over most of his face. He smelled of leather and gunpowder. He didn't ask her name, didn't look her over like a buyer. He simply reached into his coat, pulled out a thick envelope and slid it across the table. No bargaining. No questions. The room went still. Everyone knew who he was. Her father's eyes widened. Mr. Callahan, I didn't expect. How much does she owe? The voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that made men stop breathing. It's not her debt, sir. It's mine. I thought maybe... How much? Her father swallowed. Named the number. Roman Callahan didn't blink. Didn't look at Clara. The debt is paid. I don't want to see your face again. He turned and walked toward the door. Clara didn't move. The crowd had already begun to part. No one cared where she went now. Her father gave her one last shove. Go on. You're his now. She bent to pick up her satchel, just a worn Bible and a locket with her mother's face inside, and followed the stranger into the snow. A black SUV waited at the curb, engine running, breath of exhaust curling into the frozen air. Clara climbed into the back seat. The man slid in across from her without a word. She didn't know his name was Roman Callahan. Not yet. Not really. A man in the driver's seat glanced back. Where to, boss? Home. The car pulled away from the curb. The city lights scrolled past the window, neon signs, glass towers, and falling snow. He didn't speak. She didn't ask. Clara studied his face when the streetlights flickered through. He wasn't old, but violence had carved its history into his skin. 37, maybe. His hands rested on his knees, one scarred across the knuckles, the other wrapped with a strip of white bandage. No ring. Why did you pay for me? She asked, not expecting an answer. He didn't look over. 4 kids, he said. No mother. No time. Her throat caught. So I'm a nanny? No, he said. Just someone who isn't cruel. That's enough. If this story satisfies your soul, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. And subscribe because Clara's journey is just beginning. The SUV came to a stop in front of a red brick mansion set deep in the Chicago suburbs. It wasn't the lavish castle Clara had imagined, but it was solid, steadfast, as if it had stood through dozens of winters and would stand through dozens more. Snow blanketed the front yard in white. A faint yellow glow seeped from the window panes, and smoke rose from the chimney like the breath of a sleeping creature. Roman stepped out of the car first, not turning back to wait for her. Clara opened her own door and followed him into the curtain of snow. Her feet sank deep into the powdery white, the cold biting through the thin soles of her shoes. The heavy wooden door swung open, and warmth poured out from inside like an embrace. Roman stopped in the entryway and spoke curtly without looking at her. Your room is on the 2nd floor. The kitchen is at the end of the hall. Don't go into the basement. Then he disappeared into the shadows of the house, leaving Clara standing alone with a cloth bag in her hand. She hadn't even had time to move when a voice rose from the staircase. Who did father bring home? A 14-year-old boy stood blocking the steps, arms folded across his chest, eyes sizing Clara up from head to toe. His voice was cold, older than his age, as though he had learned not to trust people a long time ago. That was Caleb, the eldest son. Clara recognized it at once because he had Roman's eyes, sharp with chill and wary suspicion. In the corner of the living room, another boy sat curled in on himself with a book twice the size of his hands. Wyatt, 11 years old. He glanced at Clara for a single second, and then returned to the page, as if she didn't exist, as if she were only a passing ghost. Behind an old armchair, a pair of wide eyes looked out. Nora, 8 years old, hiding behind the velvet fabric, clutching a worn, frayed scrap of cloth in her hands. Their mother's piece of clothing, Clara guessed. The girl's gaze was full of fear, like a small animal trying to slip away from a hunter. Then a 5-year-old boy ran straight up to Clara. Sam. He tipped his head back, eyes round, and asked in a clear, innocent voice, "Are you the new mom?" The whole room froze. Caleb went rigid on the stairs. Wyatt stopped turning the page. Nora made herself smaller behind the chair. Roman stood as if turned to stone at the threshold of his study, his back to them. But Clara knew he heard. She knelt down until she was level with Sam's eyes. "I'm not a new mom," she said softly, "but I can be your friend. Is that okay?" Sam nodded, accepting it as easily as children believe in everything. But the older ones did not. Caleb ground his teeth, turned away, and strode up the stairs. "We don't need anyone." The slam of a door echoed through the house. Roman didn't explain. He only pointed toward the staircase and said to Clara, "Your room is upstairs." Then he vanished into the darkness, leaving her among strange children and a heavy silence. Clara's room was small but clean. The bed had been made up with a warm blanket. Dim lamps were already set on the table, and a pitcher of water stood by the window. Someone had prepared for her arrival. Someone had known in advance. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened. The children's whispers drifted through the thin wall. Caleb's voice saying something harsh, Wyatt's silence, and Nora's soft, broken crying, like a kitten abandoned in the rain. Clara didn't cry. She had forgotten how a long time ago. She only sat there, watching the candlelight tremble, and waited. At midnight, the bedroom door opened. Sam stood there holding a pillow, sleep heavy in his eyes, but sadness heavier still. "Miss," the boy asked, his voice trembling, "do you know when Mom is coming back?" Clara didn't know how to answer. She didn't know where their mother had gone, how long it had been, what she had left behind. She only knew there were questions with no answers, and wounds that never healed. She said nothing. She only pulled Sam up onto the bed, tucked the blanket around him, and let him curl up beside her like a kitten searching for warmth. Sam fell asleep. His breathing grew steady, light, and even, but Clara stayed awake until morning. She stared at the dark ceiling, listened to the wind shriek outside the window, and understood one thing. These children were waiting for someone who would never come home. And she, Clara Weston, assigned off in the dead of winter, had stepped into the middle of their pain without being invited. Tomorrow morning, she would have to prove she deserved to stay. Clara woke before dawn. Sam was still curled up beside her, his breathing steady, his face peaceful in sleep. She gently lifted him and settled him back onto the bed, tucked the blanket in snugly, then slipped down the stairs on quiet feet. The house was silent as paper. The pale gray light of a winter sunrise filtered through the kitchen window, just enough for her to make out the stove, the pantry cupboard, and the cooking tools hanging on the wall. Clara decided to make breakfast. It was something she could do. It was how she could prove she was useful. She found oats, flour, coffee. She lit the fire, set a pot on the stove, and began to cook porridge, but the flame was too high. The porridge boiled too fast. She forgot to stir. When she turned back, the bottom of the pot was scorched black, and a harsh burnt smell filled the kitchen. She hurried to toast bread to make up for it. But she wasn't used to this oven. The toast charred, black as coal. She brewed coffee, her hands shaking with haste, and spilled the whole pot across the table. Hot liquid ran down to the floor, spreading out like an accusation. The children appeared as the sun was just beginning to rise. Sam came down first, climbed onto a chair, looked at the burnt porridge, and grinned from ear to ear. He ate with eager spoonfuls, not complaining, too young to know what was good or bad. Wyatt came down next, glanced at the blackened toast, and said nothing. He quietly opened the cupboard, took an apple, then went to sit in a corner with his book. Nora didn't come down. She stayed hidden in her room, still clutching her mother's old scrap of cloth, still refusing to meet Clara's eyes. Caleb was last. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms folded, staring at the wreckage in front of him. Then he gave a sneer, his voice sharp as a knife. "Father brought home someone who doesn't even know how to use a stove. Wonderful. Clara didn't answer back. She bit her lip until she tasted blood and lowered her head to clean up. In her mind, her former husband's voice rang out like a cursed bell. You can't do anything right. You're useless. You're a burden. She pushed those voices away and kept scrubbing the burnt pot, wiping the kitchen floor, tossing the black toast into the trash. She didn't cry. She didn't defend herself. She simply worked in silence. That afternoon, Clara decided to make soup. Something simple. Potatoes, carrots, a little salted meat. She was more careful, watched the heat more closely, stirred at steady intervals. When the soup was done, she carried the heavy cast-iron pot from the stove to the dining table. The children were already seated there, waiting. Sam was excited. Wyatt was indifferent. Caleb was skeptical. Nora finally came down, sitting hunched at the corner of the table, her eyes still frightened. Clara walked carefully, but the kitchen floor was slick from water. Her foot slipped. Her hands lost their balance. The pot crashed to the floor. The clang of metal against wood echoed through the house. Soup splattered everywhere, scalding hot, streaking the kitchen floor. The children stood still as statues. No one spoke. Clara froze in the middle of the mess, her heart pounding against her ribs. She waited. The shout, the blow, the humiliation, the way it had always been. Her former husband had once beaten her until her ribs broke because she'd burned the rice. He'd kicked her to the floor, screaming that she was useless, that he regretted marrying someone who couldn't bear children, couldn't cook, couldn't do anything right. The kitchen door opened. Roman walked in. He looked at the soup on the floor, looked at the children standing motionless, then looked at Clara. Her face was drained of color. Her hands trembled. She stood there like a criminal awaiting sentence. Roman said nothing. He bent down, picked up the pot, and set it aside. Then he took a towel, knelt, and began to wipe the floor. Clara stared, unable to believe what she was seeing. "Are you burned?" Roman asked, his voice calm, as if that were the only thing that mattered. Clara shook her head, unable to speak. Her throat tightened. Roman finished wiping, stood up, and brushed his hands off. "It's only soup." Then he walked out of the kitchen without looking back, without a single word of blame. Clara stood there for several more minutes, her hands shaking, her legs shaking, her whole body shaking. She didn't understand. She had done wrong. She had failed. She had ruined dinner. But no one hit her. No one cursed her. No one looked at her as if she were trash. "It's only soup." Those 3 words echoed in her mind like a strange piece of music. That night, after the children were asleep, after the house sank into darkness, Clara sat alone in her room, and she cried, not from sadness, not from fear, but from something she didn't yet have a name for. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was confusion. Maybe it was a small thread of hope she didn't dare to admit. For the first time in her life, she made a mistake and wasn't punished for it. And she didn't know how to react to kindness. But real trust would only come when someone needed her. At midnight, a thin, fragile cry drifted through the narrow wall. Clara jolted upright, her heart hammering. This wasn't ordinary crying. It was the moan of pain, of fear, of a child who needed help. She sprang from the bed and rushed to the room next door. Nora's room. The little girl lay curled into herself on the mattress, her face burning red, sweat soaking her hair, her lips dry and cracked. Clara pressed a hand to Nora's forehead and flinched. Hot as glowing coals, a dangerously high fever. There was no time to think. She ran downstairs, cut through the dark hallway, and pounded on Roman's study door. He opened it almost at once, his eyes red from being up late, a stack of papers still in his hand. But the moment he saw Clara's face, he knew something was wrong. "Nora." "High fever," Clara said, breathless. Roman didn't say a word. He bolted up the stairs, and Clara ran after him. When they reached Nora's room, he stopped short beside his daughter's bed, his face turning white as paper. His hand shook. For the first time, Clara saw this man tremble. He dropped to his knees beside the bed, took Nora's small hand, and his voice broke. "Mary. Mary started like this too. Fever, then coughing, then—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Clara understood. Mary, his wife, the mother of these 4 children, had died from an illness that began with a fever. And now his daughter was burning, whimpering in delirium, dragging him back into the worst nightmare of his life. Clara stepped forward and laid a hand on Roman's shoulder. Her voice was calm, steady, as if she had been born to speak these words. "I used to work as a nurse in a trauma center. Let me." Roman looked up at her, his eyes full of doubt, full of fear, full of desperation. But she didn't wait for his permission. She began to give orders. Cool water, clean cloths, ibuprofen or acetaminophen if you have any, and a thermometer. Hurry. Roman froze for a second, as if he wasn't used to being commanded by anyone. Then he turned and ran downstairs to get everything she needed. Clara went to work. She pulled back some of Nora's blankets, laid cool, wet cloths on her forehead, her neck, under her arms. She coaxed the girl to drink water, tiny sips, patient and persistent, even when Nora, half-conscious, didn't want to swallow. She wiped her down with lukewarm water, focusing on her forehead and neck to help the body cool naturally, without causing shivering. All night, Clara didn't leave Nora's side. She pressed cold cloths to her skin, replaced them when they warmed, urged her to drink, monitored her breathing, and kept her hydrated with tiny sips of water. And she sang, softly, a wordless lullaby, a melody pulled from a faraway memory, from when she was small, from the nights her mother held her before she became the woman who stood and watched her daughter be assigned without saying a single word. Roman sat outside the bedroom door all night, his back against the wall, his head bowed, his hands clenched until the knuckles went white. He didn't come in. He couldn't. He was afraid to watch his daughter slip away the way his wife had slipped away. At 3 a.m, Caleb woke. He stepped into the hallway, saw his father sitting there, saw Clara inside, singing his little sister to sleep. He didn't speak. He only sat down beside his father, shoulder to shoulder, and waited in silence. Dawn came slowly, as if time itself was holding its breath. Pale gray light seeped through the window, then shifted to a faint gold, then to warm, steady yellow. And the fever began to break. Clara felt it before the thermometer confirmed it. Nora's forehead was less hot. Her breathing steadied. The redness in her cheeks began to fade. Nora opened her eyes, heavy and exhausted, but clear. She looked at Clara, at the strange woman who had stayed awake all night beside her, and whispered in a rough, raspy voice, "She sings like Mom." Clara didn't turn around. She didn't dare, but she heard it, and her hands shook as she wrung out the wet cloth. Roman stood in the doorway, watching Clara hold Nora in her arms. Something in his gaze changed. It was no longer cold, no longer distant, no longer doubtful. He saw something he hadn't expected. Someone had fought for his child as if she were her own. Someone had stayed through the night, had sung, had refused to give up, had refused to leave Nora alone to face the dark. That morning, when Clara came down the stairs, she was exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her hands trembled. Her legs felt heavy as lead. But she kept moving, one step at a time. Sam ran to her and wrapped his arms around her legs, his small face tilted up, his eyes full of worry and hope. "Don't go. Okay. Stay with us." Clara knelt and gathered him into her arms. "I'll stay. I promise." Sam clung to her, and for the first time, Clara felt like she belonged somewhere. From the corner of the room, Caleb watched. He didn't say anything, but his eyes weren't cold anymore. Something had shifted in him, in this house, in the way they looked at the woman who had been assigned in the dead of winter. Clara had saved Nora, but to truly belong in this home, she would need more than a single night. The days after that night of high fever moved slowly, but something had shifted inside the house. Clara began learning to cook from Mrs. Brennan, the elderly housekeeper who had been here since before Roman married his wife. She was patient, teaching one step at a time, from how to build the fire properly to how to season food so it tasted right. The first Irish stew Clara made wasn't perfect. The meat a little tough, the potatoes a little too soft. But Sam ate 2 bowls and asked for more. He said it was the best thing he had ever eaten, even though Clara knew he was only trying to make her happy. Still, she smiled, and that smile was real. One evening, Wyatt came over to where Clara sat mending, and set down a thick book. "You can read this," he said, his voice so quiet it was as if he was afraid someone might hear. "If you want." Then he turned away, not waiting for Clara to answer. It was the first step from the quietest boy in the house, and Clara treasured it more than any expensive gift. In the second week, Clara began teaching Sam the alphabet. They sat at the kitchen table every morning, Clara writing each letter on paper while Sam sounded them out. When he read his own name correctly for the first time, he grinned so wide it hurt, bounced on his feet, and threw his arms around Clara, as if she had just handed him the whole world. Nora began coming out of her room more often. She didn't speak to Clara, but she sat nearby while Clara sewed, watching the needle and thread, watching those calloused hands at work. She didn't hide anymore. That alone was a victory. Caleb was still distant. He didn't smile at Clara, didn't speak to her, didn't acknowledge that she existed. But he also didn't walk away when Clara entered a room anymore. He simply sat there, silent, observing, as if he were waiting for her to make a mistake so he could prove he had been right. The third week brought even more change. Clara taught Nora how to braid her hair, and for the first time since her mother died, the girl smiled. Not a big smile, only the faint curve of a mouth. But it was enough to make Clara turn away to hide her tears. Wyatt began reading aloud to Clara every night. He liked having someone listen. Liked having someone nod when he finished a chapter. Liked having someone ask what he thought about the story. Sam followed Clara everywhere like a small shadow, calling her Miss Clara at first, then slowly changing it to just Miss, as if it were the most natural name in the world. One night, Clara couldn't sleep. She went downstairs to the kitchen for water and found Roman sitting there alone, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes fixed on the black window. She meant to turn back, not wanting to disturb him. But he spoke, his voice low and tired. "Sit down. If you want." Clara sat across from him. They were silent for a long time, with only the tick of the clock and the wind hissing outside the window. Then Roman said, "You're not like the others." Clara looked at him. "Who are the others?" "People who want something from me," Roman answered, his voice not bitter, only weary. "Money, power, protection. Everyone wants something." Clara looked down at the glass of water in her hand and thought about her life, about what she had lost, about what she had never been allowed to have. "I don't have anything to want," she said slowly. "I just want a place where no one throws me out." Roman didn't reply. He only looked at her for a long time, and his eyes were no longer as cold as they had been on the first day, no longer as distant as a stranger's. Then he reached for the whiskey bottle, poured more into his glass, and slid it toward her. They drank in silence. No more words were needed. Some things didn't require language to be understood. That night, when Clara returned to her room, she realized something. Roman Callahan, the man the city's underworld feared, was lonely too, tired too, afraid too. He simply hid it better, behind black suits and cold eyes. And maybe they needed each other more than either of them wanted to admit. But to truly be accepted, Clara would have to get past the last gatekeeper, Caleb. One morning at the beginning of the month, Mrs. Brennan called Clara out onto the porch. She stood there with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, looking out at the snow-covered garden with the eyes of someone about to say goodbye. "I'm nearly 70, girl," she said, gentle but firm. "My back aches. My eyes are failing. I can't manage it anymore." Clara wanted to say something, to hold on, to beg her to stay. But Mrs. Brennan shook her head, as if she could read Clara's thoughts. "This house needs you more than it needs me," she said. "Those children, they're starting to laugh again. I heard Nora's laughter yesterday morning. It's been 3 years since I've heard that sound." She hugged Clara, her arms thin but warm. "This is your time," she whispered. Then she walked away, a small suitcase in her hand, without looking back. Clara stood there watching until her figure disappeared beyond the gate. That afternoon, Roman called Clara into his study. The room was dim, the curtains drawn tight, with only a weak pool of light from the desk lamp. The air carried the faint scent of rain and expensive cologne. Roman stood by the window with his back to her, holding something in his hand. "Mrs. Brennan is gone," he said, not turning around. "But before she left, I wanted to give you this." He turned, stepped closer to Clara, and placed something soft in her hands. A deep red wool scarf, the color of wine, of blood, of love. Old, but carefully kept. Every strand still intact, still carrying the warmth of the person who had knitted it. "Mary made this when she was pregnant with Caleb," Roman said, his voice dropping lower. "She wore it every winter, until—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Clara understood. "She would want you to have it," Roman went on, his eyes fixed on Clara's. "She would want someone to keep it warm." Clara's hands trembled as she accepted the scarf. She understood it wasn't just a gift. It was a relic of his late wife. It was acceptance. It was an unspoken statement that she belonged here, but someone didn't agree. A sound at the door. Clara turned and saw Caleb standing there, his eyes locked on the red scarf in her hands. His face was flushed, his eyes were wet, his mouth pressed tight into a line of pain. Then he spun around and ran, slamming the door behind him. Footsteps faded into the snow. Clara looked at Roman. He nodded. "Go." She ran after Caleb, across the backyard, past the high-stacked firewood, and found him sitting behind the shed. He was hunched on a wooden crate, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking in waves. He was crying. A 14-year-old boy who tried to be strong, who tried to be the pillar for his younger siblings, who tried to swallow the pain of losing his mother, was now crying like the child he truly was. Clara didn't speak. She only sat down beside him on the freezing crate and waited. The silence stretched. The wind moved. Snow fell softly. Then Caleb lifted his head, eyes raw and red, his voice breaking like cracked glass. "Who do you think you are?" he shouted. "You think you can replace my mother. Father gave you that scarf like mom doesn't matter anymore. Like 3 years is enough to forget. Everyone forgets her. Everyone keeps living, like she never existed." Clara didn't flinch from the rage and pain in his eyes. She held his gaze and said, her voice gentle but steady, "No one can replace your mother. Not ever. No one has the right to do that. I didn't come here to replace anyone. I came because I have nowhere else to go. Your father assigned me in the dead of winter. My former husband beat me until my ribs broke. My mother watched me being assigned and didn't say a word. I don't have a home. I don't have anyone. But I can be here, if you'll allow it. Not as a mother. Just as someone who doesn't leave." Caleb didn't answer. He only stared at her, his eyes still red, his lips still trembling. Clara stood, about to walk away and leave him alone with his grief. Then Caleb spoke, so softly she almost didn't hear him. "You saved Nora." Clara stopped. Caleb still didn't look at her. He stared down at the ground, at the white snow near his feet, at anything except her. "Thank you," he said, "for that night." Clara nodded, even though he couldn't see it. Then she walked away, leaving him alone with his pain, his memories, his love for the mother he had lost. That night, when Clara passed Caleb's room, she noticed his door was left slightly open. Caleb sat on his bed, staring out the window at the star-filled night. He didn't say anything as she walked by, but he didn't close the door either. That was the first step. Clara had been accepted, but she still didn't know what darkness this place was hiding. One afternoon, while the children were doing their schoolwork in the room, Clara wandered out behind the house. She had never gone that far before, never explored the full stretch of this vast property, and she found it. A garden, or rather, the remains of a garden. The wooden fence lay broken, weeds rose as high as her knees, and dead tree stumps stood bare as bones. The soil was cracked and parched, with no sign of life left in it. Clara stood there, staring at the desolation, and felt something tighten in her chest. Small footsteps hurried up behind her. Sam appeared at her side, his hand catching the hem of her dress the way he always did. "This is Mom's garden," the boy said, his voice so small it was as if he was afraid of hurting someone. "She grew tomatoes, flowers, even strawberries. In the summer, she used to bring us out here to pick fruit, but after she left, nobody took care of it anymore." Clara looked down into Sam's clear eyes, then looked back at the dead garden. She saw herself in it, barren, abandoned, uncared for, and yet still there, still waiting for someone to give it a chance to live again. The next day, Clara began clearing the garden. She pulled weeds up one clump at a time, her hands scratched raw by thorns. She dug into the ground, turning over slabs of soil dried hard as stone, her back aching from bending too long. In the shed she found seeds, old paper packets with Mary's handwriting on the outside, tomatoes, green beans, yellow chrysanthemums. Clara pressed each seed into the earth as if she were planting hope in a place that had already died. Each day her hands grew more calloused, her back more sore, but she didn't stop. The children began to help. Sam dug with a small spade, his face smeared with mud, grinning wide. Nora planted seeds, carefully placing each one into its little hollow, as if she were doing something sacred. Wyatt did not do the physical work, but he found a gardening book in his father's library and read aloud to Clara how to care for each kind of plant. Caleb watched from a distance, not helping, but not stopping them either. That, at least, was progress. One night, while Clara was watering in the dark, she heard a car. Headlights swept across the yard, an engine roared, then cut off. She set the watering can down and went inside. The front door opened. Roman stepped in, but not the Roman she knew. His vest was stained with blood. His face was ice cold, his eyes dark and empty of feeling. A man came in behind him, steadying him, his voice rough. "Moretti caused trouble at the docks." "It's been handled, boss." Roman nodded, saying nothing. The man withdrew into the shadows. Clara stood at the corner of the staircase and looked down, and for the first time, she saw who Roman truly was. Not the gentle father who drank whiskey alone at night. Not the man who knelt to wipe the floor when she spilled soup. This was Roman Callahan, the mafia boss all of Chicago feared. This was a man with blood on his hands. Roman looked up and saw her. He held still, as if waiting for her to run, waiting for her to scream, waiting for her to look at him with disgust. But Clara didn't run. She came down the stairs, slowly, steady, and calm. She went into the kitchen, took a wet cloth, and came back. She took his hand and wiped the blood from his rough knuckles. She didn't speak. She didn't ask. She simply wiped, one streak at a time, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "You're not going to ask," Roman said, his voice raw. "Do you want me to ask?" Clara said, her eyes still lowered to his hand. "No. Then I won't ask." She kept wiping, but Roman closed his fingers around her hand and stopped her. He looked straight into her eyes, and for the first time she saw something different in his. Not coldness, not distance, fear that she would leave. "I'm not a good man, Clara," he said, as if confessing a sin. "You know who I am now. You know what I do. This is my world. Blood, violence, death. You can go. I won't stop you." Clara met his gaze without flinching, without trembling. "I know who you are in this house," she said. "That's enough. I'm not looking for a good man. I'm only looking for someone who isn't cruel to me. You were the first man who didn't hit me when I did something wrong. You were the first man who asked if I was burned, instead of asking why I spilled the soup. You gave me your wife's scarf. You gave me a roof. You gave me children to love. I don't care who you are outside that door. I only care who you are at home." Roman stared at her for a long, long time, and something broke open in his eyes. The wall he had built for years, the armor he wore to protect himself, all of it cracked in front of the small woman standing before him with a blood-stained cloth in her hand. Clara knew he was Mafia, and she still chose to stay. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because for the first time in her life, she had something to lose. That night, back in her room, she looked out at the garden through the window. In the darkness, the first shoots were pushing up through the soil, tender green, fragile, but alive. But the darkness outside would not let them go easily. The days that followed passed in a false kind of peace. Clara kept tending the garden, kept cooking for the children, kept pretending she didn't see the blood on Roman's sleeve whenever he came home late. Christmas was drawing near, and she decided to take the children to the market to buy decorations. That morning was cold but snowless. Clara wrapped Mary's deep red scarf around her neck and led the 4 children into town. Sam held her hand so tightly he wouldn't let go for even a second. Nora walked beside her, now and then glancing at the toys displayed behind shop windows. Wyatt carried a basket, his eyes still fixed on the book he had brought along. Caleb walked last, silent, but his gaze kept sweeping the crowd as if he were watching for something. For the first time, they looked like a real family. 5 people moving through the busy market, through laughter and chatter, through the rich scent of baked bread and cinnamon. Clara stopped at a fruit stall and chose apples for the children. Sam demanded red apples. Nora preferred green ones. Wyatt didn't care. Caleb stood a few steps away, still alert. Then a shadow moved in close to Clara, a man she had never seen before. His face was laced with scars, as if someone had carved into his skin with a knife. His eyes were cold and empty, like the eyes of a dead fish. The stink of cheap tobacco rolled off him in thick waves. "You're Callahan's new one, aren't you?" he asked, his voice hissing like a snake. Clara didn't answer. She pulled Sam closer, a protective instinct rising stronger than any fear. The man smiled, a smile that never reached his eyes. "Give your boss a message. If he won't yield the docks, those pretty children will lose another mother." And then he vanished into the crowd before Clara could react, as if he had never been there at all, as if it had only been a hallucination. But the threat kept ringing in her ears, colder than the winter wind. Clara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She was calm in a way that was almost frightening. Calm the way someone becomes when she has lived too long with danger, too long with fear, too long with the discipline of staying upright when the world wants her to collapse. She tightened her grip on Sam's hand, signaled Nora and Wyatt, and turned. Home. Right now. Caleb knew something was wrong. He moved quickly to Clara's side, his voice low and tense. "What is it?" "Home," Clara said, her voice not shaking but hard as steel. "Now." They walked fast but did not run. Clara didn't want the children to be afraid, didn't want to draw attention, didn't want an enemy to see her unravel. She held herself together until the front door of the red brick house shut behind them, until the children were upstairs in their rooms, until she stood before Roman in his study and told him everything. As he listened, his face went white, then flushed red in a heartbeat. He surged to his feet, snatched the whiskey glass from the desk, and hurled it at the wall. Glass exploded into silence. shards glittering like diamonds as they rained onto the floor. He kicked a chair, punched the wall, a growl trapped in his throat like a wounded animal. For the first time, Clara saw him lose control. For the first time, she saw the monster all of Chicago feared. "Moretti," he roared, his voice thick with hate. He dares touch my family." Then he stopped. He turned to Clara. The fury in his eyes drained away, replaced by pain, the pain of a man who realized he had dragged an innocent person into hell. "I brought you into this," he said, his voice breaking. "I am sorry. You don't deserve this. You should go. I will give you money. I will send you anywhere. Leave this place. Leave me." Clara stepped closer. She saw blood on his hand where a shard of glass had cut him, dark red drops falling onto the wooden floor. She took his hand, gentle but unyielding. "You didn't drag me," she said. "I chose to stay." Roman stared at her, his eyes full of confusion, full of desperation, full of something she didn't dare name. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you stay with a man like me? You can go. You should go." "Why?" Clara met his gaze without flinching, without fear. "Because you were the first person who looked at me like I was human," she said. "Not merchandise, not a failure, not a burden, not a barren woman good for nothing. Just me. Because for the first time in my life, I have a name someone wants to say. I have children who run to hug me when I come home. I have someone who doesn't demand I be anything at all, who doesn't hit me when I make a mistake, who doesn't look at me like I am trash. You gave me all of that. You gave me a home. I am not going anywhere." Roman didn't speak. He only looked at her, at the small woman holding his bleeding hand, telling him she would stay even knowing who he was, even knowing how dangerous his world could be. Then he closed his fingers around her hand, and he didn't let go. They stood there in a room filled with broken glass, blood, and silence. For the first time, Roman let someone see that he was afraid, and for the first time, he didn't push that person away. Moretti wouldn't stop at a threat. That night, the house did not sleep. Clara lay on the bed with her eyes wide open, listening to footsteps moving back and forth on the first floor, doors opening and closing, the low rumble of men's voices carrying up the stairs. She left her room, walked down the dark hallway, and stopped at the top of the staircase. Light leaked from the crack beneath Roman's study door. Shadows shifted inside. She heard someone speak, a rough voice stretched tight with strain. "Moretti won't stop. He threatened your family. Next time it won't be just words. We have to strike first." Another voice answered. "Tomorrow night. Dock number 7. End it." Then silence. Then Roman's voice, cold as ice. "Get ready. All of it." Clara stepped back, her spine against the dark wall. She knew. Tomorrow night would be a night of war. Tomorrow night, Roman would go into the darkness and might not come back. She returned to her room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. The garden lay still in the night, the seedlings she had planted sleeping under the cold earth. She had promised she would watch them bloom. She had promised she would stay. But what if Roman did not return? A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was nearly midnight. Clara opened the door. Roman stood there, without his vest, without a gun. Not the mafia boss all of Chicago feared. Just him. Just a man with tired eyes and a fear hidden deep. "I need to tell you something," he said in a low voice. Clara opened the door wider. "Come in." Roman stepped inside and walked straight to the window, staring out at the black garden beyond. He stood there a long time, his back to her, his shoulders rigid as if he were carrying the whole world on them. "If I don't come back," he began. Clara cut him off. "You will come back." Roman turned and looked at her with an expression full of doubt, full of a desperate longing to believe it. "How can you be sure?" Clara gave a small smile, the first she could manage in a night heavy with dread. "Because you still owe me a garden," she said. "You promised you'd watch it bloom, remember? You promised you'd sit on the porch and drink coffee when the tomatoes turn red. You don't get to break that promise." Roman looked at her, and something miraculous happened. He smiled. Not the polite smile he gave business partners, not the strained smile he forced when the children were watching. A real smile, from the deepest place in him, the kind that softened the hard lines of his face, the kind that loosened the creases at the corners of his eyes. It was the first time Clara had ever seen him smile like that, and she knew she would remember that smile for the rest of her life. Roman stepped closer. He lifted his hand and touched her cheek, gently, as if he feared she might shatter, as if she were something precious he did not dare hold too tightly. Then he bent and kissed her forehead, slow, tender, like a promise, like a prayer. "Wait for me," he whispered, his lips still resting against her skin. "I'll be here," Clara answered, her voice steady even as her heart was breaking with fear. He left. The door closed. Clara stood alone in the dark, her fingers pressed to the place on her forehead where his lips had been, and prayed to a God whose name she did not know. The next morning, when Clara woke, Roman was gone. His bed was cold. His car was gone. He had left before the children woke, before the sun rose, before she had a chance to say goodbye. Clara hid her fear behind a brittle smile and went downstairs to make breakfast like she did every day. Oatmeal, toast, coffee, ordinary things on a day that was anything but ordinary. Sam came running down first, his eyes still sleepy but brightening when he saw her. "Where's Dad?" he asked as he climbed onto his chair. "Dad went to work," Clara said, her voice calm even as her chest tightened. "He'll be back." But her hands trembled as she poured the coffee. She spilled a little onto the table and wiped it up quickly, before anyone could see. All that day, Clara kept herself moving. She cleaned, she cooked, she played with the children. She listened to Wyatt read. She braided Nora's hair. She taught Sam to sound out letters. She did everything she could not to think about tonight, not to think about dock number 7, not to imagine Roman not coming home. The longest night began. The children had been asleep for a long time. The house sank into silence. A silence so complete Clara could hear her own heartbeat. She sat by the living room window, Mary's red scarf wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the snow-covered road outside. Every sound made her heart jolt. A car far off in the distance, a dog barking in the night, the wind shrieking through the cracks. But not the sound of Roman's car. The clock on the wall struck 11 o'clock. Clara stayed where she was. Midnight. She still didn't move. 1 in the morning. 2. 3. The road remained empty. The snow kept falling. And Roman still hadn't come home. Fear began to slip into her mind like poisonous snakes. What if he doesn't come back? What if Moretti wins? What if right now Roman is lying somewhere in the dark, blood spilling onto the snow, his eyes lifted to the sky while his lungs no longer draw breath? What will happen to the children? They already lost their mother. They can't lose their father too. And her, what will happen to her? Would she be assigned again? Thrown out again? Turned into a piece of merchandise no one wants? Clara didn't cry. She had forgotten how a long time ago. She just sat there, her hands clenched around the red scarf until her knuckles went white. And she waited, waiting for good news, waiting for bad news, waiting for anything except this terrifying silence. Near dawn, when the sky began to shift from black to gray, headlights swept across the window. Clara shot to her feet, her heart wild in her chest. She ran to the door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the lock. The familiar black car rolled to a stop in the yard. The door opened. Roman stepped out. He was alive. His vest was torn open at the shoulder. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. His hand was wrapped in white bandage already stained through with red. He moved slowly, heavily, as if each step took effort. Behind him, 2 of his men were half carrying someone even more badly wounded into the house. But Clara didn't look at them. She only looked at Roman. Only Roman. Roman came toward her, one step at a time, through the snow that had been stained red beneath his feet. Clara didn't run to him. She just stood there at the doorway, waiting for him, the way she had promised, the way she always would. Roman stopped in front of her. His eyes were exhausted, bloodshot from pain and sleeplessness. But there was something there. Relief, warmth, life. "I'm home," he said, his voice rough. Clara didn't speak. She didn't need to. She took his uninjured hand and drew him inside. Into the house, into warmth, into the place where he belonged. She guided him into the kitchen, sat him down in a chair, and went to work. Warm water, clean cloths, gauze, antiseptic. She washed the cuts on his face, gently wiping away the dried blood. She removed the old bandage from his hand, checked the deep gash, then wrapped it again with careful precision. Her hands didn't tremble anymore. She was calm in a strange way, as if she had been born to do this. Roman sat still and let her care for him, his eyes never leaving her face for a single second. "You're not going to ask what happened?" he asked softly. Clara didn't look up. She kept winding the bandage. "Did you win or lose?" Roman was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We won. Moretti is finished." Clara nodded and tied the final knot. "That's enough. I don't need to know anything else." When she finished and started to stand, Roman caught her hand. "Stay." Clara looked down at his hand holding hers, then up into his eyes. They looked at each other by the weak candlelight, in the warm kitchen, in the stillness after the storm. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Roman drew her closer, gently, slowly, as if he feared she might vanish if he moved too fast. Then he rested his forehead against hers. They stayed like that in silence, their breath mingling, listening to each other's hearts. Two people who had been broken, shattered, emptied by loss, finding one another in the dead of a Chicago winter. When the children woke the next morning, they found Roman and Clara sitting at the kitchen table. 2 cups of coffee had long since gone cold. Early sunlight streamed through the window, painting warm gold streaks across the wooden floor. Sam came running down first, and when he saw his father, he shouted with joy and threw himself into Roman's arms. "Dad's home! Dad's home!" Roman held his son, his arm tightening around Sam's small body. But his eyes were on Clara, on the woman who had waited all night, on the woman who had bandaged his wounds, on the woman who had not run even after she knew who he was, as if she were the reason he came back, as if she were the home he had been searching for all his life. The war was over, but spring had just begun. Spring arrived slowly, but with a certainty that couldn't be argued with. The snow retreated bit by bit, revealing the damp black earth underneath. The days grew longer, the sunlight warmer, and Mary's garden began to wake. Clara spent every spare moment out there. She turned the soil, sowed seeds, carried water, pulled weeds. Her hands grew more calloused with each passing day. Her back ached every night, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. This garden had belonged to Mary, and Clara would bring it back to life. The children began to help. Sam dug with a small shovel, his face streaked with mud and his grin bright from morning until night. Nora watered the plants, pouring each dipperful as carefully as if she were doing something sacred. Wyatt sat on the porch, reading books about gardening and writing down the important parts to read aloud to Clara. And Caleb, for the first time since Clara arrived, came down into the garden on his own, took up a hoe, and began working beside her. He didn't say anything, but he was there. That was everything. Then one morning, Clara stepped into the garden, and her heart broke into pieces. Half the seedlings had died overnight. The frost had been too cold, too ruthless, and it had killed the tender shoots she had tended for weeks. Leaves hung limp, stems had collapsed, roots had turned black. Clara sank to her knees among the ruin, touched the dead leaves with her fingertips, and felt as if she were dying with them. Sam ran out, stopped beside her, and asked in a worried little voice, "Miss Clara, why did the plants die?" Clara couldn't answer. Her throat tightened. She wanted to cry. She wanted to scream. She wanted to give up, to let the garden die the way it had been dying for 3 years. She had tried as hard as she could, and it still wasn't enough. Footsteps came up behind her. Roman stood on the porch, looking at her kneeling among the wilted leaves. He didn't speak. He only came down, slowly, and knelt beside her. "Some plants are still alive," he said gently. Clara shook her head, her eyes wet but refusing to let the tears fall. "It isn't enough. I failed." Roman picked up one seedling that was still green, still alive, still trying to reach upward in the middle of the wreckage. He held it out for her to see. "Even one is enough," he said. "You taught me that. One night, you saved Nora when the doctor said there was no hope. One person changed this whole house. One plant can change an entire garden." Clara looked at the seedling in his hand. Small and fragile, but still green, still living. She understood. She replanted. From the beginning. She didn't give up. Every day she went back out at first light, watered, tended, and prayed to some god whose name she didn't know. She sheltered what had survived, sowed new seeds, and waited. Roman began coming out every evening. He didn't work. He simply stood there on the porch, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching her, watching those roughened hands break the earth, watching her back bend with fatigue, watching her refuse to surrender even when the world wanted her on her knees. Then that morning came. Sam burst into the house like a whirlwind, shouting so loudly the whole place jolted awake. "Miss Clara! Miss Clara! Come out here! Hurry!" Clara ran into the garden, her heart pounding, bracing herself for the worst. More dead plants, disease, wild animals, but Sam didn't lead her to death. He led her to the corner where the tomato vines were climbing their bamboo trellis, and he pointed. The first red tomato. Small, split along one side, not perfect, but red as blood, red as love, red as hope, alive. Clara dropped to her knees, her trembling hand reaching out to touch it. And for the first time in a very long time, she cried. Not the tears of misery, not the tears of fear, tears of happiness, the tears of someone who had planted and finally seen the harvest begin. Roman stepped out and stood beside her. He looked at the red tomato, then at Clara weeping in the garden. "How did you grow it?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. "This soil was dead." Clara looked up, tears still sliding down her cheeks, and she smiled. "Nothing stays dead forever," she said. "Not if someone is willing to love it." Roman looked at her hands, calloused, cracked, dirt under the nails. Hands that had worked without rest for months. Hands that had refused to quit. He took her hand, lifted it, and kissed the back of it, slowly, tenderly, as if honoring something sacred. "You don't need rain for something beautiful to bloom," he murmured. Then he kissed her, right there in the garden, under the warm spring sun. No one watching, no music, no pretty speeches, just two people who had been broken, who had been shattered, who had lost too much, finding one another among the rows of vegetables and the scent of damp earth. That night, they sliced the tomato into 6 pieces, one for Sam, one for Nora, one for Wyatt, one for Caleb, and one for Roman and Clara to share. They sat around the table and ate slowly, as if it were the finest feast in the world. Sam chewed fast and declared through a mouthful of food that it was the best tomato he had ever eaten. Nora nodded in solemn agreement. Wyatt offered a rare smile, and Caleb, the 14-year-old boy who had refused to accept Clara for months, looked at her and smiled. For the first time, a real smile. Clara smiled back, and she knew it. She finally belonged here. Love had bloomed, but one promise was still missing. Summer came. The garden bloomed the way it hadn't bloomed in 3 years. Heavy red tomatoes hung thick on the vines. Green beans climbed and covered the trellises. Yellow chrysanthemums blazed along the fence line. And Clara stood in the middle of it all, looking at what she had built, what the children had built with her, what months of refusing to give up had finally made possible. One night, after the children were sound asleep, Roman knocked on her bedroom door. "Come with me," he said, gentle, but with something unusual underneath. Clara followed him down the stairs, out the back door, and into the garden. Moonlight spilled everywhere, laying a silver spell over the rows. The scent of chrysanthemums drifted thick in the air. Roman stopped in the center of the garden and turned to her. "I have something I want to say." He didn't kneel. He didn't pull out a velvet box with a diamond ring. There was no rehearsed speech. He simply took her hand, 2 calloused hands clasped together, and looked straight into her eyes. "I can't promise a peaceful life," he said, his voice low and slow. "I can't promise there won't be enemies. I'm a dangerous man, Clara. My world is cruel. Tomorrow there could be another man like Moretti. Next week someone might want to kill me. I can't promise you'll be safe." He paused and drew in a deep breath, as if gathering every scrap of courage to go on. "But I can promise you this. You'll never be assigned again. Never be thrown out. Never have to stand alone in a crowd waiting for someone to buy you like merchandise. You'll have a name, a home, and children who call you Mom." His grip tightened around her hand. "Clara Weston, do you want to stay? Forever?" Tears slid down Clara's cheeks, but she smiled. She smiled because for the first time in her life, someone was asking her what she wanted, not ordering, not forcing, not buying, asking. "I don't need promises about the world outside," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "I only need you. Because for the first time in my life, I'm being asked. Not assigned like an animal, not used like a slave, asked like a human being. I'm staying, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because there's nowhere else I want to be." Roman didn't speak. He only pulled her into his arms and held her tight, as if he feared she would disappear if he let go. The wedding took place a week later. Not a lavish affair with hundreds of guests. No champagne, no 10-tier cake. Just Roman, Clara, the 4 children, and an old priest. They stood in the living room with late afternoon sunlight pouring through the windows, and it was everything they needed. Clara wore a simple white dress. No lace, no jewels. Around her neck was Mary's red scarf, soft and warm as the embrace of the woman who was gone. When Clara walked into the room, it wasn't her father who escorted her, not the man who had assigned her in the dead of winter. It was Caleb. The 14-year-old boy stood tall, broad-shouldered, his face serious but warm. He took Clara's hand and led her to Roman, and when he placed her hand into his father's, Caleb spoke softly, only loud enough for the 3 of them to hear. "Mom would like her." Clara nearly cried. Roman swallowed hard. But they didn't cry. They only looked at one another, and everything was said without words. The priest began the ceremony. When he asked Roman if he took this woman, Roman didn't say yes the way people usually do. He said, his voice ringing out, certain and clear, I didn't save her. She saved this house. When the priest asked Clara if she took this man, Clara answered, without taking her eyes off Roman's, I didn't come to replace anyone. I came to stay. Sam clapped and cheered. Nora cried, tears streaming down her cheeks even as she smiled. Wyatt offered a rare smile and nodded as if giving his approval. Caleb stood still, but his eyes were warmer than they had ever been. That night, for the first time in her life, Clara slept without fearing she would wake up alone, without fearing she would be thrown out, without fearing she would be assigned, without fearing she would be hit. She lay beside Roman, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, and felt something she had never had before. Home. For the first time, she had a real home. For the first time, she belonged to someone. For the first time, she was Clara Callahan. But happiness never came easily. The winter came early, and more brutal than any year before it. The wind cut like a knife. The snow piled so thick the windows iced over, and the cold slipped into every crack of the red brick house. Roman began to cough. At first it was only a light, dry cough, as if he'd caught an ordinary cold. Clara pressed ginger tea on him, piled on extra blankets, told him to rest. But Roman was Roman. He didn't rest. He still went out to do his work, still held meetings late into the night, still walked into the snowy dark. The cough grew heavier, from dry to wet, from occasional to constant. Clara watched him weaken day by day, his face growing paler, his steps heavier, and still he wouldn't listen to her. Then one day, a loud crash came from the study. Clara ran in and found Roman on the floor, unconscious, his face burning red with fever. The doctor arrived within an hour. He examined Roman, listened to his lungs, took his temperature, then stepped out of the room with a look full of worry. Severe pneumonia, he told Clara in a low voice. He's weak. I can't promise anything. The children stood outside the door, their faces white as snow. Sam gripped Nora's hand. Wyatt stood frozen like stone. Caleb leaned against the wall, his jaw locked tight, forcing every emotion down. Nora broke into sobs, the sound tearing Clara's heart to pieces. Is Dad going to leave us too? She asked in a shaking voice. Like Mom. Clara dropped to her knees and pulled Nora into her arms, pulled Sam close, drew Wyatt and Caleb in with them. No, she said, her voice steady even as her heart was breaking. Dad isn't going anywhere. I promise. But inside her, fear grew larger than it had ever been in her life. Larger than the night she was assigned. Larger than her former husband's beatings. Because now she had something to lose. She had Roman, and she couldn't lose him. The first night, Clara didn't leave Roman's bedside. She pressed cool cloths to his forehead, administered the medication the doctor left, and carefully monitored his shallow breathing, just like the night she had cared for Nora months earlier. But this was different. This time she was 100 times more afraid. Roman drifted in and out of delirium with the high fever. He tossed, drenched in sweat, murmuring words that made no sense. Then he began to speak names. Mary, he whispered, pain breaking through his voice. Mary, I'm sorry. I couldn't save you. Clara held his hand tighter and said nothing. She understood. He was remembering his wife, dreaming of the woman who had died from an illness just like this, afraid he would go the way she had gone. Then he said another name, Clara. Clara, don't go. Clara leaned down, her lips close to his ear. I'm here, she whispered. I'm not going anywhere. On the third night, Roman was worse. The fever wouldn't break. The doctor came again, examined him, then shook his head. He didn't speak, but his eyes said everything. Caleb stood outside the door all night. He didn't go in, didn't look at his father lying there so weak, but he didn't walk away either. His eyes were red, his jaw rigid, his whole body pulled tight like a string about to snap. He was afraid, but he would not allow himself to cry. Clara stepped into the hallway and stood in front of Caleb. She didn't say much. She just opened her arms. You don't have to be strong with me, she said gently. And Caleb broke. The 15-year-old boy who had tried to be grown for so long finally cried. He cried like the child he should have been allowed to be, his shoulders shaking in Clara's arms, his tears soaking her shoulder. On the 5th night, Clara was exhausted. Dark circles hollowed her eyes. Her hands trembled. She hadn't slept for 5 days, but she didn't leave. She couldn't leave. She sang to Roman, the lullaby she had sung for Nora the night the girl had burned with fever. Her voice was rough, breaking, but she didn't stop, and she spoke to him, whether or not he could hear. You're not allowed to die, she said, her voice a command, a prayer, a plea all at once. Do you hear me? You still owe me. You promised you would stay. You promised you would watch the garden bloom every spring. You promised you would sit on the porch and drink coffee with me when we grow old. You promised, Roman. You don't get to break it. The 7th day. Dawn. Pale gold light slipped through the curtain seam and fell across Clara's face where she had collapsed beside the bed. At some point she had drifted off, her hand still gripping Roman's, her head resting on the mattress edge. A hoarse voice pulled her out of sleep. You look like hell. Clara opened her eyes. Roman was looking at her. His gaze was weak, his face pale, but he was looking at her. He was alive. Clara didn't speak. She couldn't. She only cried. Tears ran down her cheeks like water, uncontrolled, and she didn't want to control them. For the first time in her life, she cried from relief. He lived. But what would life after the storm look like? In the days that followed, Roman recovered slowly, but surely. First he managed to sit up in bed, his back propped against pillows, his eyes still tired but carrying a faint spark again. Then he could stand, legs trembling, one hand braced against the bedrail, but standing all the same. Then he could walk, one heavy, careful step at a time, like a child learning to walk for the first time. And with every step, Clara was there. She steadied him when he swayed. She waited when he needed to rest. She didn't leave him for a single second. One morning, as Roman sat by the window looking out at the snow-covered garden, he turned to Clara. You stayed for all 7 days, he asked, his voice still rough. Clara nodded. I told you, I'm not going anywhere when you need me. Roman took her hand, his fingers much thinner after the illness, but still warm. I don't deserve you. Clara met his gaze. Her eyes were still shadowed from sleeplessness, but her look was unwavering. You don't get to decide that, she said. I do, and I already have. When Roman grew stronger, the children were allowed to visit. They burst into the room like a storm. Sam ran in first, climbed onto the bed, and wrapped his arms around his father, shouting so loudly the whole house could have covered its ears. Dad's better. Dad's better. Nora rushed in after him, sobbing, clinging to her father's hand as if she could never let go. Wyatt stood at the foot of the bed with a rare smile and a nod that seemed to tell his father he had known he would make it. Caleb stayed in the doorway, not stepping inside, but his eyes were red and his mouth was smiling, the smile of someone who had just escaped a nightmare. Roman looked around at his 4 children, at Clara standing beside him, and he understood. This was his family. This was the reason he had fought to live. Heaven gave me a second chance, he said thickly. I don't intend to waste it. Spring that year arrived like a miracle. The snow melted, warm sunlight poured in, and Clara's garden bloomed more richly than ever. The earth itself seemed to exhale in relief, as vibrant colors returned to the soil Clara had so tirelessly tended. The garden became a sanctuary of life, where every budding flower and ripening fruit served as a silent celebration of Roman's return. It wasn't just a collection of plants anymore. It was a living testament to the family's resilience and the love that had pulled them through the darkest winter. Roman and Clara stood on the porch, watching the children play among the rows. Sam was chasing Nora. Wyatt sat beneath a tree reading. Caleb was fixing the fence, working without anyone telling him to. You gave me something I thought I didn't deserve, Roman said, his eyes never leaving the children. Clara rested her head on his shoulder. You gave me more. You gave me a name people wanted to say. You gave me children who run to hug me when I come home. You gave me a place to belong. You gave me you. The years flowed like water. Spring became summer. Summer became autumn. Autumn became winter. And then spring again. The children grew up. The house changed. But love did not. Caleb stepped into his father's place, becoming the head of the Callahan family. But he did it differently. With less blood, less violence. He told his men, his voice firm but not cruel. Real strength doesn't need blood. My father taught me that. Wyatt became a lawyer, the first in the family to go to college. He graduated with honors, opened his own office, and devoted his career to defending the vulnerable. Women beaten by their husbands, children abandoned. People like Clara once was. Nora married a kind doctor she met at the hospital. She had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. And every winter she still wore her mother's red scarf. The scarf Mary had knitted, the scarf Clara had kept safe, and now it belonged to Nora. Sam became a teacher, working at the elementary school near home. He still laughed as easily as he had as a child, still carried hope as if the world held nothing to fear, and he still called Clara Miss instead of Mom. But the meaning was the same. Roman stepped back from the shadows. He handed everything to Caleb and spent his days in peace beside Clara. Every morning they sat on the porch, drank coffee, and looked out at the garden. They didn't need many words. They only needed to be near each other, only needed to know the other one was still there. One autumn afternoon, when yellow leaves covered the yard, Nora's grandson ran up to Roman. The boy was 6, wide-eyed and curious the way all children are. "Grandpa, why does everyone call this the Garden of Clara?" Roman smiled, took his grandson's hand, and led him to the garden gate. On the wooden beam, he had carved a line many years earlier. "She doesn't carry my blood, but she gave birth to the rest of my life." The boy stared at the words, sounding them out one by one, then looked up at his grandfather with a puzzled face. He didn't understand all of it. He was too young to understand love, sacrifice, redemption. But he knew one thing. His grandfather loved his grandmother very much. The years kept moving. Roman's hair turned white, his back bent. Clara's eyesight dimmed. Her hands began to tremble. They grew old together, one day at a time. But every morning they still sat beside each other on the porch. Every morning they still drank coffee and looked at the garden. Every morning Clara still wrapped Mary's red scarf around her neck, and Roman still looked at her as if she were the greatest miracle he had ever seen. And the garden kept blooming, season after season, year after year, like their love. But every story has an ending. One autumn night, when yellow leaves lay scattered across the yard, and a sharp, cool wind slipped through the window seams, Clara did not wake up. She went in her sleep, gently, peacefully, the same way she had lived in the last years of her life. Her face was calm, without pain, without fear. Her hand was still holding Roman's, the way it had every night for so many years. Roman woke at dawn and knew at once. Her hand was cold. Her chest no longer rose and fell. She was gone. He did not scream. He did not cry right away. He only lay there, gripping her hand, looking at the serene face of the woman who had saved his life in every way that mattered, and whispered his goodbye. The 4 children, now grown, came back to the red brick house. Caleb arrived first, then Wyatt, then Nora with her husband and 3 children, then Sam. The house filled with the sound of crying, the crying of children who were no longer children, crying for the mother who did not give birth to them but had loved them like her own. Roman buried Clara beneath the apple tree in the garden, where they had kissed for the first time under warm spring sunlight, where they had stood side by side and stared at the first red tomato, where she had brought the garden back to life and brought his life back with it. He carved her headstone with his own hands. He did not let anyone else touch it. Each letter he cut into the stone, with all the love that was still left in his aging heart. The words on the marker were simple, but they held an entire lifetime. Here grew everything she was never given, and everything she gave away. At the funeral, Caleb read the eulogy. His voice, now the voice of a grown man, trembled as he spoke of the woman who had changed his life. "She didn't give birth to us," he said, "but she taught us how to live. She taught us that family isn't blood, it's the people who choose to stay." Nora laid the red scarf on Clara's grave. The scarf Mary had knitted, the scarf Clara had protected, the scarf Nora had inherited. But then she picked it up again and wrapped it around her own neck. "She would want me to keep it warm," Nora whispered. 2 years later, Roman aged quickly. Without Clara, the house felt hollow. Without Clara, the mornings no longer smelled like coffee. Without Clara, the garden still bloomed, but no one sat with him to watch it. Each dawn found Roman back at the place where their journey had truly taken root, whispering to the woman who lived on in every leaf and petal. He spoke to the headstone about the beauty of the harvest, noting how the deep crimsons of the garden reminded him of her heart, and how the sweetness of the air still carried the lingering warmth of her presence. Sam visited last week. He still laughs the way he did when he was little. He asked about you. I miss you, every day. One winter morning, Caleb came to visit his father the way he always did. He found Roman sitting in the porch chair, his face turned toward the garden, toward the grave beneath the apple tree. His eyes were closed. His face was peaceful, as if he were asleep. But he didn't wake again. They buried Roman beside Clara, beneath the apple tree, just as he had asked. 2 graves lying side by side, the way the 2 of them had lain beside each other for so many years. On Roman's headstone, Caleb carved the final line. At last, he came home. Many years passed. The red brick house still stood, the garden still bloomed. Decades later, the echoes of their love still resonated in the laughter of great-grandchildren who played in the shade of the ancient apple tree. As they gathered the bounty of the land, they felt the sacredness of the soil, knowing that every inch of this vibrant landscape was a gift from a woman who had taught an entire family that the most beautiful things are those we choose to protect and love. On the front fence, the wooden sign was still there, weathered, rotting, but still readable. The sign Roman and Clara had nailed up together decades earlier, when they decided this place was home. Forever. Not for sale. Because someone was allowed to stay here. That was enough. Wind moved through the garden. Leaves whispered. And somewhere, as if from far away, there was laughter. The laughter of children running through the beds. The soft hush of a lullaby in the night. The sound of two old people drinking coffee in silence, needing no words because they understood each other down to the bone. Some stories end, but some stories become immortal. And this is one of them. The story of Clara and Roman reminds us that a person's worth isn't found in what they give birth to, but in what they choose to become. Clara was called Barren, useless, a burden, but she became the mother of 4 children, the wife of 1 man, and the soul of a home. She never gave birth to a single child, but she raised an entire family. She had nothing when she walked into that house, but she left everything behind when she went. Sometimes, the people the world abandons are the ones with the biggest hearts. Sometimes broken pieces, when fitted together, make something more beautiful than perfection. And sometimes, all it takes is one person who isn't cruel, and that is enough. If this story touched your heart, please press the subscribe button on our channel, hit like, and share this video so more people can listen to meaningful stories like this every day. How do you feel about Clara's journey? Have you ever met someone like Roman? Someone who saw value in you when the whole world turned away? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly want to hear the stories from the deepest places in your hearts. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a happy life, and peace every day. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.